Okay, let me do a quick review of where we came from. By the way, I put this up because I want to make sure everyone knows we're just following Neil's book as a textbook. We're just going chapter by chapter. Here we go. And I'm doing the illuminated version, so it's kind of fun, actually, if you read through the book and you just go online and start typing in online some of the things he references, you find a lot of new stuff. So what you'll see here is some of that, and there's tons more, too. So it's sort of fun just to take that as a skeleton and go on it. But let me show you a summary from last week that I didn't show, because last week we talked about restoring the New Testament text. And when I say restoring the New Testament text, we're talking about the Greek version. So what does the original Greek of the New Testament look like? And you take all the evidence that's laying around, all the manuscripts, and you try and come up with what you think is your best shot at what the Greek was that the original autographs were. So we talked last week how you do that and how you make those choices. But there was also, it started this debate back then about there's actually two different streams of manuscript, what do you want to call it? Manuscript traditions of the Greek New Testament. And this left one, which we looked at, this is the UBS 5, the United Bible Society's number 5 edition of the Greek New Testament. And that's actually a current picture. This edition 5 was done in 2014. And it spawns basically every modern translation. So if you were hired to be a translator of the New Testament, you would start with this Greek document right here, which is the sum total of a couple hundred years of manuscript collections and adjudication and trying to figure out when there's differences, which difference wins, stuff like that. So especially if you do it in another language around the world, it'll always start with this right here. This is the core starting place for every translation in the world. But there's a parallel track that has resisted that, which is the King James Version. And the King James, we saw the history of this, comes out of this tradition of Erasmus, his first Greek New Testament. So he's actually the first to do this Greek New Testament. He was the first one to publish it in 1516, and his third edition, where he fixed all of his errors because he was so fast. That actually is an astonishingly good result when he did that, and it came to be called the Textus Receptus, or the text that we've received. And that has been seen to be, for people who are very pro-King James only, has been seen to be superior to all the other collected documents that have ever been found. And I wanted to show you what this looks like. Oh no, look at all the numbers. So what I did here, this may not be 100% correct, but I think it's about 99. So if you go across the top, it's the century, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way up to the 19th century. That's the centuries. That's 100 years is every one of those bars. And these 3 rows are the different manuscripts that we have. So, for instance, the uncials, the number next to those is the number of manuscripts we have in that style that were written in that century. Okay? So, for instance, the uncials, we have 3 of them that were written probably in the 3rd century. And we say 3rd century, we mean the 200s, right? Okay? So, and then the minuscules, which is the lowercase Greek writing style. It looks more like current modern day lowercase Greek. You see the style actually starting to come up in the 4th and 5th centuries as a style of writing. And then it's very popular in terms of, if you wrote Greek in the 10th century and on, you would write it in minuscules, not in uncials. The uncial is capital Greek, right? So you see, so these are the documents that we found. Of the minuscules, and they all have been penned very late, after the 10th century and stuff like that. And then there's the lectionaries that we have that were penned even later than that. So it's the stuff that was found written by pastors of churches where they quote the Bible. So if you look at the Erasmus did his Greek New Testament in 1516. That's the 16th century. So I show the bar right there pointing to when he wrote his Greek New Testament, and the sources he used are there. 2 from the 15th century and 5 from the 12th century. That's the entire manuscript basis of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, which is the entire text basis for the King James Bible. Okay? Now, when the King James Bible came later, there was a smattering of other manuscripts of this era, but they're still dated between the 10th and 15th centuries. So the King James Bible translators did a great job based on the manuscripts they had, but none of their manuscripts preceded the 11th century that were penned. And that's a key thing here. So there's, I kind of shaded it green because it's somewhere in these smattering that some of them, but they didn't use too many other documents. They pretty much relied on the 7 manuscripts that Erasmus started his Greek New Testament. Now, let's talk about modern translations. So Westcott and Hort were the guys who did their Greek New Testament in the end of the 19th century. Remember them? And they compiled all the stuff together. They were using a huge smattering of these different texts here, going as far back as the 7th century. So they have a much, much larger number of manuscripts, and they reached further back. And they had one ace in the hole, and that ace in the hole was Sinaiticus, which was written way back here, 3rd to 4th century, probably 4th century. So that right there, that big ace in the hole over there, really changed the whole picture about the accuracy of the Westcott-Hort Greek New Testament. Big deal. Now, they didn't reference any of these others because they weren't discovered yet. So these things and we're going to talk today about new discoveries since even Westcott and Hort. Westcott and Hort were the end of the 19th century. We're going to move into the 20th century today and see a bunch of new things that were found in the 20th century. But I just wanted to show you the difference between those two. Westcott and Hort came up with a Greek New Testament that has a broader base in terms of lots of documents, and one Sinaiticus, which was written earlier than everything else we've ever found. So when you get into the debate between King James only folks, Textus Receptus, the 7 documents we looked at, and all these other documents, what it usually comes down to is a debate about just the ace in the hole text, Sinaiticus. And they'll say that Sinaiticus, although it was written very early, 3rd century, 4th century, even though it was written very early, many of them suspect that Sinaiticus was a plant to deceive by Constantine and all of his guys. So that's where the debate ends up coming down, kind of a historical debate. It doesn't take into effect, though, the fact that there's a ton of newer documents that Westcott Hort also used in addition to Sinaiticus, and they were in agreement. So the King James only debate is a debate about the source text for the Greek. That's what it really is. Okay, I didn't do that last week. I just wanted you to see that. Today, we're going to add a new line of manuscripts, and they're these papyrus ones. What? And look how early dated they are. Wow, way cool. We even have one that's written in the 2nd century, in the hundreds AD. In the hundreds. So that's like within a generation of the writing of some of the documents. So anyway, we're going to look at those. Now, why weren't these on the list used by Westcott and Hort? They weren't discovered until the 20th century. So that's what the story today is. What are these papyruses? Why did it wait so long for them to be discovered? And what do they say? And the real big thing about these papyruses, the big question is this: do these papyruses support the ace in the hole text, Sinaiticus? Because that's at the center of the debate about which scripts we should be using. So let's take a look. So those are the ones we're going to look at today. And it's a 20th century manuscript, interesting thing. And they call it manuscripts from the sand because papyrus was the writing media for Egypt, because along the banks of the Nile you had papyrus plants. They didn't grow anywhere else. So when they figured out how to make paper out of them. So that's actually the writing material there. The dominant writing materials in the rest of the world are animal skins. Because they have animals, they don't have papyrus. There was a time where Egypt was exporting papyrus paper to the rest of the world, and it cost a ton of money. And on top of that, the papyrus didn't last very long. But they were exporting it around the world. They were the sole supplier of papyrus for the entire world. But what happens to papyrus? It rots in humidity. So here's the story, and Neil does a good job about talking about where the papyrus thing started. Herculaneum, remember Mount Vesuvius blew up in AD 79, Pompeii, all that kind of stuff. Well, when they did some archaeological digs there, starting in the 1700s, they found what looks like a library, and it's called the Villa of the Papyri. And in this gigantic villa they found, in this library section of it, they found actually the entire library of rolled up papyruses laying like they were in stacks in a library shelf. Because the volcano went off, poof, and pyroclastic flow comes and burns everything. But the papyrus was in there, and they didn't get totally burned, they just got charred. while they were wrapped up. So they found a whole library of them. I mean, more than 2,000 of them inside there. And in the 1700s, no one ever expected to be able to find papyrus in Italy from the 1st century. So that sparked a huge change in thinking about archaeology and looking for them. Here's a picture of some of them just still laying in the shelves, just like that. And they're very fragile. You can't unwrap them without destroying them. So even to this day, there's a ton of effort going into seeing if we can read them using x-rays and stuff like that. Scientists have read ancient scrolls not opened since they were carbonized by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius almost 2,000 years ago. This is in an article from Nature. So to this very day, even this year, they're still using technical means to try and read the words in these without unwrapping them. Because when you unwrap them, they just go to nothing. They're ash that's still rolled up, but you can see the ink on them. I don't know what the ink's made of. It's usually carbon stuff, but they can see it. So you've got these charred, rolled up papers of papyrus. They still haven't read a lot of them, but they know that a lot of them have to do with Greek wisdom literature, not New Testament. So there's no New Testament here, at the Vesuvius finds. There's no New Testament there. But what it did is it sparked, at least in the 1700s and the early 1800s, a real interest in seeing if papyrus is surviving other places in the world. And so that's how that figures in. That's why it got to be a really big deal. And then someone said, well, if you go down to Egypt, this area called Fayum, and Fayum is interesting because they started opening up some mummies and found that the mummies were wrapped in papyrus that had written stuff on them. Kind of cool. And they said, so since it's in Egypt, of course it makes sense you'd find papyrus in Egypt because of the papyrus plants, but also it's dry, and so maybe the papyrus is going to withstand the sands of time and they're going to come to us. So they found these papyruses that are wrapped around the mummies. Fayum is interesting because it was once a well-established city area in Egypt. Around the time of Alexander the Great, it kind of got Greekized. And it was highly occupied by a large Greek community. And it flourished where it was, not because, the desert should have killed it, but they had canals that fed it. So the canals made this really a thriving Greek community for several hundred years. And so they thought, if we're going to find Greek information on papyrus, go to Fayum, because the canals went into disrepair, and so it turned into a ghost town in Egypt because it didn't thrive anymore because there's no more water there. So it turned into a ghost town, and basically, like in the movies, it got covered over by the blowing sands. So they figured if we can find Greek papyruses anywhere, they may be buried in Fayum. And when they went there, they found them on different kind of mummies and other stuff. So that triggered a huge land rush in the late 1800s by archaeologists to go looking for papyrus in Egypt because it probably has survived. So many exploration funds were put together to look more in Fayum and to dig in the sand. And these guys, Grenville and Hunt, who are actually very famous, they went down there. I think they came from Oxford. Grenville and Hunt went down. And they said, this is an interesting thing, let's go in the area to a town called Oxyrhynchus, or I don't know how to say it. So, but they went there particular because in the history, Oxyrhynchus was a very famous Christian community in the area. So if we're going to find Greek New Testament, that might be a good place to start digging. So Grenville and Hunt went down there in the end of the 19th century, and they started digging. Now, it's known as a Christian town in about 200 to 400 AD. So if you found something written in 200 to 400 AD, that would still be earlier than most of the manuscripts we have. So that would be a find. So that was the gold star for them, was to go down there. So here they are, Grenville and Hunt, both younger than 25. Really new scholars, so they were hungry to make their reputation on finding New Testament papyruses penned in the 3rd or 4th century in Oxyrhynchus, which was a Christian community. Maybe we'll find something. We don't know. So they go down there and they start digging. They find very little until they turn their attention to the dump in town. And when they get to the dump, they find a ton of stuff. They came home with 280 boxes of papyrus. A ton of stuff. And they eventually sifted out the ones that were New Testament, And along with the other 30,000 copies, they called it Logia Jesu, which is the sayings of Jesus our Lord. They found 30,000 copies of different papyruses, but only about 24 of them were New Testament. So it was a little overblown by the statement right here. But they were really good New Testament finds. I mean, really early. 27 manuscripts were New Testament. 20 of those 27 were written in the 2nd to 4th century. So the 100s to the 300s. So they all predate Sinaiticus. Cool. Now the test is up to see if Sinaiticus, which was the oldest thing at the time, is correct. Does it agree with Sinaiticus? Or did Constantine and his goons change Christianity by writing Sinaiticus and putting, that was the whole contention at the time. So here's one of them. They started cataloging them, and at that time they had to come up with a new lettering system. We have the lettering system for the other manuscripts, and they started to use just the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and all that kind of stuff. Sinaiticus came along late, and they wanted to give it an A letter, but something else already had the A letter, so they give it the A from the Hebrew alphabet, which is Aleph. Vaticanus was known for a long time. They gave that a B for Vaticanus. But anyway, remember that lettering system? Well, now they had to come up with a new papyrus lettering system. So it's a P with a number superscript. So P means papyrus and the number of the... So if you ever read through some of this stuff, you'll see the papyrus finds are all cataloged by a P number. So P1, they found there, and it's got Matthew, a lot of Matthew, in fact. I like the Scotch tape down here. But they've got Matthew penned in 250 AD. Predates Sinaiticus. Predates everything. And at the time P1 was found, it was the earliest New Testament document in existence. So they hit the treasure trove when they went the dump there in Oxyrhynchus. So there's P1. In fact, you can go online and type P1, and it'll tell you a ton about the history of this document and how much of it's there. And so Lightfoot goes through, and he gives us sort of a thumbnail sketch of some of the more important papyrus finds that are part of not only Oxyrhynchus, but other finds. So. But this came out of the desert with Grenville and Hunt, this one right here. And then there's if you go another 30 years past them, you get to the 1930s, Chester Beatty, the papyri, called the Chester Beatty Papyri, named after the guy who basically owns them. He purchased them. So he comes out with a whole new collection that's found because people start digging in the sands in Egypt looking for papyrus New Testament, and they start finding it in a bunch of different places as well. So all of a sudden, all this worldwide focus is on Egypt to find Greek New Testaments. And part of the collections that are known comes out of Chester Beatty's collection. And so he writes a book. It's more like a pamphlet, The Text of the Bible, A New Discovery. And Sir Frederick Kenyon, who has become the name in New Testament archaeology and documents, is the one who writes this. So he gives by putting his name on this, he gives a big thumbs up to Beatty's collection. Beatty's collection, and there's 11 manuscripts. 8 of them are Old Testament in Greek Old Testament, and then 3 of them are New Testament. And then to show the world, he built a library in Dublin, Ireland, to house them to this day. Beatty's American, by the way, but he just lives overseas. So that's what he did. And if you go there, if you go to Dublin, that's what you'll see. That's his library. And if you go inside, those different manuscripts, most of them are on display. You just walk right and look at them. So if you doubt about the origins of the Bible, you can go in and just look at them. So there they are. Yeah, that's what it looks like. It's kind of a cool place. Here's one of them. This has the conversion of Paul on it. So this is P45 if you're keeping track. And Lightfoot goes through a lot of the P numbers. But this is written in 250, around 250, middle of 3rd century. And you can see the papyrus is starting to fall apart. But there's no doubt about it. This is Acts. Acts 8 and 9 are on this papyrus right here. So kind of cool. Another famous collection of papyruses, now these are papyruses, came in the 1950s, so it's another 20 years after that. And we get to the 50s. Bodmer was a Swiss guy, I think. He's European. I forget where he's from, but another kind of rich philanthropist in that sense. And he starts a collection, and he buys a collection of papyri that are found in Upper Egypt, north of Thebes. By the way, upper in Egypt means down. Upper means above sea level. As you go south in Egypt, you go higher in sea level, so you're going up in the air. That's how you have to think about it. So if you go south of the Nile Delta, that's upper. So anyway, he's got a collection. These come out in 1952. So look, it's within our lifetime. 22 total manuscripts in Greek and also Coptic. So Coptic is useful for this particular case. There are 3 New Testament manuscripts, and they're substantial. P66 is a really big one. It's almost all of John's Gospel. Almost all of John's Gospel. And it was penned around 200. All of John's Gospel. Now it's really sort of astonishing. It's all of 1st and 2nd Peter and a ton of Luke and John. And they all basically come from the same codex book. So these are fragments from one book where they were bound together. So around 200 AD, you've got these 3 Gospels in 1st and 2nd Peter that we know by evidence were bound together and in circulation and in Egypt. Wow, by the 200s. It's astonishing. The Bodmer collection is just really an astonishing thing. Here's part of P66. Oh, it's cool. And this is John's Gospel. And you notice it's in the capital letter Greek. So that's the uncials. The more capital letter it looks, the older it is, remember? And there's no breaks between the words. So that also tells you it's really early. So you use a lot of that style stuff to figure out that stuff. So you have to actually look for words that you recognized. I recognize this right here, the KAI, that means and. So yeah, substantial. Yeah, I'm really good at this. I didn't bother to really look at this very carefully. Yeah. Well, it's in Greek, that's the problem. And it's in Old Greek. So anyway, that's P66 is a marvel. In Bodmer's collection is P46 too, almost all of Paul's letters. Almost all of Paul's letters. And again, look at the date on this. It's around 280, give or take, a couple of decades on each side. So, and we know for a fact that around 100 AD, all of Paul's letters were in bound circulation by 100 AD. And Paul's letters were the earliest thing actually penned in the New Testament, penned in the 50s and the 60s, and then distributed amongst all the churches around. And we're going to look later about Colossians today. So they were penned very early. They were distributed very early. They went into copy distribution very early. So by 100 AD, it's not unreasonable that if people had copies of the New Testament, it was Paul's letters. And here's one that was in circulation. Yeah, Pam. So there's no differences when they find it? These old ones are the same as what we've got now? Tiny differences. That's what's really remarkable about these. These get the older and older and older. And of course the question is, so does it change much? Yeah. No, it does. That's what's really nice about it. And especially Sinaiticus, which is 4th century, it doesn't change that. So you basically have almost 100 to 200 years between many of these papyruses and Sinaiticus, which we use as the ace in the hole, and they're nearly identical. So that's really encouraging. So these letters that were in circulation, these were one of those. It's just astonishing. There's 2 Corinthians right there. That's just really bizarre. Originally, we know this codex that Paul's letters had 104 leaves. P46 has 86 of them. So we have almost, we have a pretty good collection, 80% of the original codex of all of Paul's letters. Well, I shouldn't say all of Paul's letters. I got to take that back. There's a couple that are missing, but it's missing. It's missing the pastoral letters. So what they did is they put in circulation the letters that were addressed to the churches, but the pastoral letters, the ones addressed to Timothy and to Titus, to people, they left those out. So I think the reasoning was maybe we should put into circulation the ones that are deliberately written to the churches. We'll bind those together and circulate them. But the Timothy and Titus stuff, those are personal letters. So they didn't bind those. It's interesting. Oh, well, there it is right there. And that's the order. Romans, Hebrews, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. No 1st and 2nd Timothy, no Philemon, no Titus. Now this one's interesting. This is the oldest text of the New Testament we have. There's another collection by John Rylands. Rylands is another collector, another philanthropist. He's got tons of cash, so he ended up buying a lot of these finds as they came out. So Rylands did that. And Rylands bought this fragment right here And it's a piece of John 18. It's written on both sides, actually. It's only about 3 inches tall. But interesting, it is John 18. There's no question about that on both sides. It's the oldest, and they, through an excruciating amount of work, it was determined that it was about at 125 AD. Not quite as early as 100, but definitely earlier than 150. So 125, and there it is. If you ever go to Manchester, England, there's a very busy roundabout in England. Right off that roundabout, I mean, it's like core center urban Manchester. Right off of that, there's this little building that's the Rylands Museum, and smack dab in the middle of Rylands Museum is this fragment, P52, sitting right there in acrylic and glass, so you can look at it. It's 125 AD. Now, what's fascinating, if you think about this is the Gospel of John. We're pretty sure John's Gospel was written last, probably very late, and there's a lot of debate about, well, how late, 80s or 90s AD, that late. So John penned this, let's say 90s, early 90s AD, and here we have a copy that's just 30 so years later. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. And by the way, when you look at these, the fragments of John 18 inside that, it matches exactly the Greek New Testament we use to do modern translations from. Exactly. So didn't have to do any changes for that. Here's P75 from the Bodmer collection again. I really like P75. It's got Luke and John in it. And again, it's dated very earlier than everything else that we had. So these papyrus collections really changed the entire game of what we know. What's interesting is that it's Alexandrian style text. And when we say Alexandrian or Western, we talked about that last time. It really talks about sort of a style of writing and how the penmanship and how it looks, basically. It's just how the letters look. So you can sort of pin down which area of the world it was penned in based on the slight style differences. So the style, this is Alexandrian, which would match a lot of the documents that came out of Egypt. And Vaticanus, which we've known about for a long time, is in this style. So it validates the Vatican early codex from the 4th century, 5th century. And it's virtually the same as B, that's Vaticanus. So this is what's interesting. We know the Vaticanus was penned somewhere in 325 to 350. Really sure of that, really sure. And this was written how much earlier? Well, over 100 years, maybe 150 years earlier. So then the question is Vaticanus accurate? Well, we can check something. It even has the same writing style. The penmanship is Alexandrian, just like Vaticanus, and it matches nearly perfectly. So you can look at Vaticanus and say, well, again, not another Constantine plot, because this is pre-Constantine, this document right here. So these are really great validating documents for those. Agrees 92% of what's in John, 94% of what's in Luke. So, and you say, oh, well, it's not exact. Well, yeah, but when you go and you catalog the differences, they're inconsequential. They really are. Next week, we're going to start Old Testament text. So we're doing a big shift right now. We haven't talked about Old Testament text at all right now. Next week, it's different because the whole stream of how we get the Old Testament is entirely different than the New Testament. So we've seen everything from the New Testament, and we'll switch to that. Okay, let's do...